Okay, so as I mentioned before I started recording, I had to, for some reason, the previous link isn't working. It didn't recognize me as the host, so I couldn't even get into that. I was put in the waiting room for some reason, so I switched it over to this link. So if anybody didn't get the announcement, I do apologize. But this is recorded, so you will be able to watch it after the fact. Okay, so there's no real announcements for the course at this point. Just a reminder, your exam 2, many of you have seen or potentially seen that it has been graded. Some of you, it hasn't been graded yet. We're in the process of finishing that up. And the final grade should come out by the end of today for exam 2. And then once all of those are finished and the scores are in, the original scores, I should say, those 6 points from the previous announcement, there are 3 questions that I explained a little bit in more detail in the announcement that weren't, the greatest explanation or weren't the best, most well written. So I removed 3 questions from the multiple choice true false of the exam. So again, regardless if you got those correct or incorrect on the exam, you'll get full credit. So everybody will get 6 additional points added on to their score. And I did make an announcement, but I'll say it again here in case anyone missed it. I did add on the 4 points from exam 1, so all of your scores should be updated now from exam 1. But please let me know if by chance I skipped over you. There were a lot to enter, so it is possible. But just let me know and I can check and add those if I didn't already do so. Okay, so with that, today we're going to talk about Module 3, sections T9 and T10. And all of this really has to do with population growth. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see, go over the cogbooks with me. All right. So can everybody see my shared screen of cogbooks right here?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Pull up my notes real quick, make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, so what this does in this first couple sections is it goes through some actual models where we can estimate population growth. So what we're doing with population growth, that's just the change in the number of individuals in a given population over time, right? And they give us these different equations. So the first one is exponential growth. And what's going to be important for the exam is, I will say right off the bat, this exam is going to be the most math-heavy exam of your 5 exams. You are going to have to know these equations, and you are going to have to be able to do some of the calculations, especially from the activities and from these examples. That being said, I'll make a course announcement about this too with more detail, but for exam 3, I allow everybody to have kind of a cheat sheet, I call it, where you can have a full-size printer page. So is that 11 by 8.5 inches, and you can write anything you want on that. You can write definitions, you can write equations, you can include figures, whatever you feel is going to help you for that exam. It's a source of notes that you can make that are, you can use during the exam. The only restriction on that is the size of the paper. You can use the front and back of it, and it has to be handwritten. And all you have to do at the beginning is just show the computer screen your notes real quick, so it can verify what what the notes and that they're handwritten essentially, and then you can use those during the exam. Because I don't want you to have to memorize necessarily all these equations. I'd rather have you write some examples and know how to use them for this exam. That being said, I do encourage you, like I said, you can put anything you want, but I highly encourage you put a lot of the equations on the note card for the cheat sheet for this exam. Okay, so let's start with exponential growth. So not only are you going to have to know a little bit about it mathematically, like how to plug the numbers in and do the estimates, but also you're going to have to know it conceptually. So then that means you're going to have to know what these variables mean and how the changes in these variables can affect your estimates for population growth, and also some of the assumptions that go along with these models. So with exponential growth, we have the equation here where we have a population at time t. So that's any time in the future. It's equal to population at time 0. So n is the population number. E is a constant. The value of that, I think, is like 2.71 further decimal. And then R is the growth rate, and T is the time that we're interested in, right? So are we estimating for 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 20 years from now? So how far into the future are we estimating for this growth of this population? If we want to talk about it, what are maybe some of the assumptions of the exponential growth model? So if we think of it at a population level, what is it assuming about the population?
It's assuming that the population is increasing.
It could, or you could have negative growth. Sorry, from the chat, are we allowed to have blank sheet of paper as well? Yes, you can have scratch paper as well, which might be helpful for doing some of the calculations. But are there any restrictions with this model? Let's maybe think of it that way. What do populations need to live?
Resources.
Exactly, right? Resources, food in particular, some from the chat, resources again. Yeah, very good. Does this model assume that resources are unlimited or finite?
They're unlimited.
Yeah, so
Ideal.
yeah, exactly. Ideal conditions, it says. This is a very basic model. So it assumes that resources are essentially unlimited. It also assumes that all individuals are the same, right? It assumes that all individuals have the same probability of surviving, the same probability of reproducing. There's no differences in age categories. We'll see that more complex models as we get further into the cogbooks. But this is the most basic, very baseline kind of model. And under ideal conditions, as we said, generally we do tend to have positive growth, and it seemingly goes to population sizes of infinity. And this example right here, we can walk through it together real quick about exponential model. So it talks about mice. Our beginning population is 100. The intrinsic rate of growth, which is R, is 0.4. And then the time to increase is 5 years, right? So we have all our information, and they even give us the answer that we're looking for. So it should be 739. So what we want, take the equation, and now we know that it's n of 5 that we're looking for. So year 5, right? And n of 0 is the starting population. That's 100 that we are given. E is that constant. Most scientific calculators and even some basic calculators have the E function built in that you can just press E and it'll give you the value. You don't have to put in an actual value. And then it's just to the power of R times T. R is 0.4, that's where that comes from. And T is the time, so 5 years. So we plug that in, do the math, and we get, in 5 years, it'll go from 100 to 739. So we know that this is growing pretty rapidly. And then this shows us that we can use the derivative, that if we're given different bits of information, we can calculate the intrinsic rate of growth a different way. So this is getting a little bit more into calculus. I'll tell you right now, you won't have to calculate the derivatives and solve for R. It'll be more set up where you're given all the information and you plug it into the equation and then you solve for it that way. Okay. And then the next page talks about geometric growth. So how is this different than the exponential growth model? Maybe
So-
conceptually, let's think of it that way first.
This model is based on like populations that have like a single season where they reproduce. So it's like you have to look at this model either 2 or more years so you can see if there's an increase or decrease, because it's based on a season or multiple seasons, but it's a multi-year model.
Yeah, so season is a great example to use. I think we can think of it even more general. It doesn't have to be season, it's just distinct time points. Seasons, realistically, seasons are a great fit for this model. So if we look at the exponential growth and the geometric growth, the curve is basically the same. It's not as smooth because we have this distinct time points that we need to connect. So you can see it's kind of almost a little more blockish or square compared to the exponential growth. And if we look at the equation itself, it's a little different, right? We have n of t, so we do want to know the change in population over time. And it's got some of the same information. It has n of 0, so that's the starting population. But now it has this lambda character in there. What does lambda mean? So it's a ratio, right? So it's just expressing a population's size in 1 year to its size in the preceding year. So it's basically similar to R. It's going to affect the growth rate of that population. And then T, again, that's just time. So how many time points? And again, it could be seasonal, it could be yearly. It's just whatever we want to plug in. And
If we
here
have
we
a
have an example. So go ahead.
We have a certain measurement for lambda. Like if we're measuring lambda in years, do we also need to measure time in years, or does it matter? Do they need to match?
So I don't, because it's a growth rate, it doesn't give us actual units right here. I agree with what you're saying that if it's a rate, it's going to be something per time. So yeah, the units should match. And I don't think they give any examples where it doesn't, but that's a fair question. Does that make sense? Okay. So if we have our equation, n of t equals n of 0 lambda to the t, and we're given information that lambda equals 1.5 and 5 years for t, we ask what is the new population? So we plug in lambda 1.5 to the power of 5 times 100, and that gives us our 759. But if we back up for a second, it talked about, where is it? There's certain value ranges for lambda. Yeah, so right here. So a value greater than 1 means that the population has increased from 1 year to the next. When the lambda is less than 1, the population has decreased from 1 year to the next. So knowing that those values for lambda, if we come down here and we see a value of 1.5 for lambda, and the original population is 100, and we ask, do we think the population is going to be more or less than 100? How would we be able to know the answer to that? We won't know the exact answer, but we'll know if it goes up or down.
Because the lambda is greater than 1, so then you know that there's been an increase in population.
Absolutely. Great. So if you're asked to do a calculation for geometric growth, you can do kind of like a quick check saying like, well, I know that I have 100, lambda's over 1, so it has to be over 100. So if you do the math and it's like 75, you know that maybe something went wrong with your math. So it's kind of a way to check that you're at least in the right direction when calculating geometric growth. And again, this gets into a little bit more math of how we can compare the exponential and geometric growth model and essentially solve how lambda would equal R. But you know this a little bit conceptually, but we're not going to have to do any calculations with this. I think that's a little bit more advanced calculus level than what we need to for this course. I'd rather just be able to calculate using the exponential or using the geometric growth model. Can you estimate what the populations are going to be? And then here, this kind of just shows how we can look at, there's actually like a typo. There's supposed to be the lambda signal right here instead of this little dot. So it got kind of cut out somehow. But this just shows us what we just talked about. Like if lambda is less than 1 and we know that R is less than 0, we know that the population is going to decrease. So you might get asked conceptually, if lambda and R values are this, do you expect the population to increase, decrease, or stay the same? And we can know that if lambda is equal to 1 and R is equal to 0, that's when the population will stay the same. It won't grow over time. If lambda is greater than 1 and R is greater than 0, we'll expect a positive growth in that population. Any questions about the geometric model or the exponential at this point? Okay, well, we can keep moving. Just don't want to go too fast, and obviously stop me as you are if you have any questions. Okay, so what is doubling time? What are they talking about here?
We're talking about the time it'll take for the population to double in size.
Yeah, exactly. If you have a population of 100, how many units, generally in years, sometimes it might be in months, depending on what units they're using, will it take for that population of 100 to go to 200? So in order to do that, we have to solve for t, right? So if we have, for instance, we have the exponential growth model right here. If we want to solve for t, we're going to have to do some algebra and rearrange that model. So the first thing that we can do is we can, if we want to get rid of this n of 0 over here, we have to, it's because it's multiplied to the e to the rt, we have to divide over here, right? So it's going to be n of t over n of 0 equals the remainder on that side, e to the rt. And we still, actually, hold on. Before we move on to more algebra, we know something theoretically, right? We know that this we want to find the doubling time. So we know that this value, n of t divided by n of 0, is going to be 2, no matter what the numbers actually are. It could be 12. The original population could be 6, and we want it to double, so that has to be 12. The original population could be 100, and we want it to double, so that's going to be 200. So whatever these numbers are, they're going to equal 2. So that's kind of a shortcut why all of a sudden that 2 appears in this half of the equation. But we still want to solve for t by itself, so we have to move some more variables around here. And in order to drop e, we have to take the log. So the log e will just kind of eliminate e, but on this side, you're going to have log base e over here. It's going to be inserted, and that's going to be log base e times 2 equals rt. So we're getting closer to isolating t. And eventually what we do, the last step, is to divide this side by r. So t equals log base e2 divided by r. And it tells us that we know that log base e of 2, if we calculate it, it's about 0.69. So we can enter that number in here, and it has to give us the lambda value of 2.78 so that we can add that in here. So we have 0.69 divided by log base e of 2.78. If we plug that in, we get 0.67 years, or here they converted the units to days. So for this population to double, it's going to take either 0.67 years, or we can say at 246 days. So does this example make sense on how we would isolate t to find the doubling time? Is there a step in there that didn't make sense, or?
It makes sense. I think the only question I have is how do you do a log base E? Is it just log on the calculator?
I think you would have to specify e, because if you just do log, I think that's the standard log base 10.
Yeah. Okay.
But we don't have to actually enter that. If we want to just remember, it gives us log base e. Well, actually, no, that's log base e of 2. Sorry, but yeah, no, you'll have to be able to enter that into the calculator. So
Okay. Okay.
And I don't have a scientific calculator in front of me, but I can look at that at another time if anybody has questions about that.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so that's the some of the theoretical and then the math behind doubling time. All right. And then it gets into, maybe moves a little bit away from math for a few slides, where we get into density dependence. And that, simply put, is just certain factors affect population size in relation to the population density, right? And then it talks about negative density dependence and positive density dependence. How would we describe negative density dependence?
Negative density dependence is when something gets so dense it's harmful to the population, so it becomes like a negative factor.
Or it could become a negative factor in a sense that the growth rate decreases as the population increases, right? So there's a negative and a positive associated with this.
Yeah, it becomes negative in the curve of the population growth, not necessarily to the population itself. Right? Or is it both?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
It becomes like negative in the sense that it negatively affects the population, like increase growth graph, but also could it be negative in the fact that it decreases the fitness of the population as well?
Well, it could start to decrease the fitness of the population. That's a good point, because one of the things I wanted to ask and bring up is, what causes negative density dependence? Why don't they just continue to grow exponentially?
It's like limiting factors, like limiting resources, limiting space, stuff like that.
Yeah,
Because
limited resources is a good one. What about when the population is small? So
that's the
considering, right, when the abundance is small, that's when there's going to be an abundance of resource. But as that population increases, the resources become limited. So it's because of the initial small population, but when it reaches a certain level, it's going to kind of eat itself out of home and run out of resources, and that's why the growth is going to decrease. Right? So if we look at, where's my cursor? We look at this figure, this shows us we have progeny per adult fruit fly. So this essentially is how many offspring the adults are making, and this is the population density. So what we're going to see is in the beginning, when the population is at low levels, each adult is making a lot of offspring. But over time, the rate of growth decreases as that population increases. So the adults are making fewer and fewer offspring over time because there's less resources for the adults, so they can't allocate as many resources to reproduction, and there's probably even less resources for their offspring. So it is kind of like, what do they call it? A self-thinning curve, I think, somewhere on the page. Is that term? Yeah, so down here they talk about how it's a self-thinning for the population. So it's kind of a population control in a sense, based on resources. If we look at a figure like this, we have 60 seeds, 1,400 seeds, or 3,600 seeds. So we start with different densities, and we have plant mass on the x-axis. So when we have less dense seeds, we have more than around 1 gram. So we can say that, the average is about 1. But with 1,400 seeds, the average drops, right? There's very few large seeds, or there's very few plants with large mass and many plants with very light mass. And it gets even worse when we condense it even further. So it's overcrowded. You're going to get very small, as you said, less fit, essentially, plants because they have higher densities. Okay. And then in this next one, we have the opposite, positive density dependence. How would we describe that?
The growth of the population increases as the density of the population increases.
Yeah, exactly. So it's it's both positive here, right? The rate's increasing as the population number is also increasing, or the density. So on a curve, it would look something like this, where it's more of a positive slope. Then what about in real life? Do we see negative and positive density dependence in isolation? Or can there be kind of some overlap?
I think there's overlap, especially with like plants. I feel like it's a lot of the positive is like the more examples we're given about plants, because like I live in the South and we grow corn, and it's like you have to have so many acres allotted to it because it's not self-pollinating. So you have to have enough to pollinate everything. And so it's like but you can't overcrowd it because then it won't flourish.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And maybe even depends on the population itself, right? So if we have this figure right here, kind of shows the mix of them coming together, where we have population size or density on the x-axis, and then growth rate on the y-axis. When the population size is low, we have initial fast growth, right? So we have positive density dependence in the beginning, but as that population size increases, we see the curve change, and it goes down, right? The population continues to grow, but the growth rate actually inverses and decreases. So it goes from positive early on when there's not a lot of individuals, and the growth, is important, and there's a lot of resources. But then when we have more individuals and the resources become more limited, we see that switch to negative density dependence. And then this is just more of a real life example with actual data. So it's not quite as clean, but we see the same idea with these fish, right? So it's abundance of adult herring on the x-axis and the ratio of young herring to adult. So basically how many of the adults are producing. In the beginning, it goes up, right? They're producing more and more offspring as the population grows. And then because the population continues to grow, the adults are just producing less and less offspring. But overall, the population continues to increase because they're still producing something.
And is this due
But-
to like as the population increases, then the resources decrease, so then the parents can't produce, like they don't have enough resources and like in order to produce offspring. So like it kind of ties into like allocation of resources.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This, as you can see, this is building to that allocation of resources idea. So, and it overlaps with what we did on the previous exam. So it could be a number of resources. It could be energy, right? So they could have less food available to them, so they're not able to produce as many offspring. It could be that there's a resource like a nesting site. So some fish actually need space on the ground, kind of like a bird nest. Like a lot of bass do this, I believe, where they actually develop a nest on the floor of the like a pond or a lake. And if this bay is full, they can't reproduce. So then that bass isn't going to be able to reproduce. If it's
I know
more
in
crowded, it's sorry, go ahead.
I know in like really small ponds, like oxygen is a problem. And it's like if the population gets too large, there's not enough oxygen supply because we have to have an aerator in our pond because if it just goes over a little bit one season, then next winter all the fish are dead.
Yeah, that's a great, I mean, like I said, I was trying to list numerous resources. It could be oxygen, like you just said. We talked about space for nest sites. It could be food that they're eating. So any, there's multiple types of resources that could be limiting where they're not able to produce as many offspring. So awesome. All right. So now we talked a little bit about why the curves are the way they are, and now we get into logistic growth. So this is another way to calculate population growth. And what is different about this model compared to either exponential growth or geometric growth? What's new with it or different about it? We look at the equation, we have R again, that's our intrinsic rate of growth. We have N again, that's population size. What's K? We haven't seen that yet.
Carrying capacity.
Yeah, so this incorporates the idea of carrying capacity. And what is a carrying capacity?
The max, the max population that the environment, like that the resources in the environment can hold. So like
Yeah,
I
I think
that was
that's
a weird way to say it, but yeah.
you're definitely on track. I think it's a simpler way to put it is it's just a limit in the number of the population for a given area under a certain set of conditions.
Yeah, that
And a
was
lot of times it's resources limiting, right? Because we would say, we can just say already, carrying capacity in a single population can change over time. And that can change because of the different resources that are available. So I think it's on the bottom of this. Yeah, so if we go to the bottom of this page, right, we have these two different, I think like parasites or something, bacteria maybe, I'm not positive exactly what these are, two organisms, let's just say that, right? And they give them two different treatments. They give them low food supply and they give them high food supply. And then they just measure their population over time and basically until it plateaus. Because when it plateaus, that shows that it's reached its carrying capacity. So with high food, it climbs up to about 195 where it plateaus, and low only climbs to 105. And that should make sense, right? When you have less food, you can support fewer individuals. So that it has a lower carrying capacity. When you have more food in the environment, it can support more individuals and you have a higher carrying capacity. So these are not set hard numbers all the time. They're set in relation to the conditions of the given environment. Because you could also have something there like disease. There's a certain disease in the environment and it has a 10% mortality rate. The carrying capacity is going to drop by 10%. And when that disease, if it's eradicated, the carrying capacity could increase by 10%. And what the curve looks like is a little different, right? So early on, we see what is similar to exponential growth, right? Where we have very rapid increase up to this inflection point, which is the point where it's the fastest growth. And then after it reaches this inflection point, the resources in the area start getting depleted, the growth rate starts to decrease, and eventually it tapers off and it hits its carrying capacity, right? And this is where it has no more growth. The population cannot sustain any more individuals, so the growth rate in an ideal situation drops to 0. So like it says, it describes it as this S-shaped curve. And if it asks us to do calculations again, it's going to have to give us, what the population is, what the carrying capacity is, and what the growth rate is, and ask in order to plug it in to do this calculation with this. I don't think it has any examples on this page. And again, this gets into, kind of switching it. We can, take the derivative and solve for the rate, but just understand that that's possible. We're not going to worry about how we're going to take derivatives and have to calculate this. This calculus is not a requirement or prerequisite for this course. But, all right. So any questions about logistic growth?
I'm sorry, I think I missed it. You said as long as they give us like a plug and chug, we'll have to do the equation for it on the exam. But if there's not, then that's not something that we're doing.
Yes, I would say that that's a safe way to word it. If they don't give you like the activity or a really worked out example, you will not be responsible for doing that calculation at all. If they do give it to you, you will be responsible for knowing it. It's not 100% that it will be on the exam, but it can be on the exam. Some
Okay.
of them will be, but not all of them necessarily.
And like hypothetically speaking, this doesn't provide an example, and therefore then it will not most likely be an equation.
In this case, there's not an example so far, but I do believe if we go into the activities,
Okay.
if there's nothing in these activities, I forget actually offhand if it has one for logistic growth. I know it talks about all of them, but I would say exponential growth, geometric growth, and logistic growth know how to do the math in them.
Okay.
Okay. And this one is kind of just a matching one, right? Where it has the two different equations, where it kind of cuts up the exponential growth equation. So it's the basic one. And basically the point is it doesn't consider carrying capacity in exponential. Logistic, it does, where it has K in there. And this one actually, isn't this even wrong? Yeah, this equation right here is not even correct. It's supposed to be 1 minus n over k, not n minus n, or k minus n over k. So please note that and check your notes. This version of the equation is not correct. Okay. What about equilibrium size, though? If we know we're talking about the exponential, we know we're talking about the logistic. Those are the two that we're comparing. What is the equilibrium size in the exponential model?
There's not an equilibrium.
Yeah, right. There's no equilibrium because it assumes that resources are unlimited and that all organisms have an equal chance of reproducing. So there's really no equilibrium. It will just go to infinity. What about the equilibrium size in the logistic growth model?
Okay.
Yeah, right, that's just the carrying capacity. So how do we measure maximal growth rate or for the exponential equation?
No competition?
No, that'll be the next set of the
Oh,
next
sorry.
boxes. No worries. So someone said R, right? Yeah, exactly. So growth rate is just represented by R in the exponential. And then how is growth rate represented in the logistic?
The R times 1 minus N divided by K.
Yeah, so this one is what they want, but again, it's wrong, but I'm glad you said it correctly. Thank you, where it's the 1 minus N over K. So I'm not sure. I'll have to email Cogbooks and let them know that there's a couple errors on this page. Okay, now we're at competition though. So again, this gets at the assumptions of the model. What does the exponential model assume about competition?
That there is no competition.
Yep, there's no competition because the resources are unlimited. And then obviously the only competition left is intraspecific competition. For the logistic, intra means within, so that intraspecific is competition within species. So they're only competing against, so we have a species, a deer mouse, it's only competition against other deer mouse for competition for those resources. It's not advanced enough to compete with other species. It doesn't consider predators in either one of these. So these are, simple models, but they're getting a little more complex and adding more variables in to make them more realistic as we go along. Because what essentially is a model, if we think of it in terms of ecology and math?
It's an estimation of like how the population will behave based on like previous populations and how they've behaved. Like we create these models based on the data we've already gathered.
Sure, so that's a more specific answer. You're definitely correct. Like, so a model on population growth would be an estimate of how that population is going to change over time based on certain variables that we're measuring. But in a more even general sense, I would say that a model is a representation of reality, right? We're trying to replicate something. We can even think of this, it doesn't even have to be math. It could be a model car that we buy from a box that's plastic and we glue it together, right? That's a model of a car. It's got some accuracies, the shape, the color, some of the parts, what they look like, but it's not a real car, right? Because they say a lot of times no model is absolutely correct, but some models are useful. So and the point I'm trying to get at is that we're just building up more useful models because they're a little bit more realistic by adding all of these new parameters in. And this last box, this is just the shape of the curve, right? So exponential, we've seen that goes to infinity. The logistic growth, that's that S-shaped curve where it tapers off at the carrying capacity. All right. So let's go through some of these activities because I think those would be good. We obviously will see the answers, you are able to see them on your end too. But let's talk about why these are the correct answers. I think that's going to be the important part. So this first one says, which model assumes that individuals of a species compete for resources? And we've already kind of talked about this. So, and this is really just basically comparing, again, the exponential and the logistic growth model. So let's say it verbally here. Which model is highlighted that assumes individuals of a species compete for resources?
The logistical growth model.
Yeah, exactly, right? And the reason being is because it has that carrying capacity. So it's showing that resources are limited, and when resources are limited, there's going to be competition. And this is just the opposite question, right? Which model assumes that resources are unlimited? Well, not the opposite, but kind of what we already said. Which resource or a model assumes that resources are unlimited? And that's the exponential model, right? Okay. And then this one, which model assumes that individuals in the population are identical? And we see the answer here. Yeah, he says, you said too, both models. But why? Why are both models assume that the individuals in the population are identical? Or what does that mean?
I mean, you just said it right. Like the competition is amongst themselves. Like you can't compare and contrast two different species within these individual models.
I wouldn't even, don't, let's not think about it in terms of competition even. So if we think about it, but we will think about it like of interest specific about the single species. So that we'll stay on that page.
I think it means that
But
like all of the type, like all of the individuals in the species are on the same level. It's not accounting for like the really high performing or the really low performing individuals. It just like kind of puts them at a baseline or even an ideal.
yep, exactly. I think that's a great way to put it, right? It doesn't assume that if we want to talk about competition, it assumes their competitiveness is equal. It is, if we want to talk about reproduction, it assumes that every individual is equal, that they have the equal likelihood of reproducing. It talks about every individual has the same likelihood of surviving. Now, in reality, is that true?
No.
No, but this is, this is better than the exponential model. But as you can tell, this is only module one. We're going to get into more complex models that are going to account for different age structures and differences in individuals that way. So this is kind of just, getting us to understand, what are the limits of these models and what do they actually tell us? Because we always want to know those two things. What are we looking for? And, how can we add to the model to make it more realistic? Okay. So number 4 says, which model assumes that the individuals in the population differ? So that's kind of the opposite of what we just said, right? And for these two models, the answer is going to be neither, right? It doesn't assume that either any of the individuals differ. It assumes, as we said before, that they're all the same. Okay. And then number 5 says, which model describes a population that grows exponentially? So should be pretty simple, right? It's in the name. All right, the exponential model. I think we're all on the same page there.
The
And the
exponential.
numbers, sorry, go ahead.
I said the exponential model. I was just copying it.
Oh, yep, no, but that's perfect. Appreciate the participation. And number 6, it says, which model describes a population that never grows exponentially? And it says that it's a logistic model. Do we agree with this question?
No, because at the beginning of the logistic model, it grows exponentially until it reaches its like the middle point, and then it switches into like lowering the growth until it reaches the carrying capacity because it's sigmodal.
Yes, exactly, right? It's that S curve. So in the beginning, it even uses the word initial exponential growth in cogbooks early on. So I think this question is just worded a little poorly, right? It could say which model describes a population that doesn't continuously grow exponentially or doesn't grow exponentially late on and when the population is at a higher density. So just keep that in mind. It's a poorly worded question, and it's good that we can find it and we can explain why. Nice work. Okay, so. And then this gets into kind of the knowing and understanding the theoretical background of the models and what the terms are. So we could say, so presented for you is a logistic population growth. So we have our equation up here, and it says which term in the model describes the number of individuals. And it's obviously highlighted, it's N, right? What does R represent?
The rate.
Yes. What kind of rate?
The rate of growth.
Yeah, so a growth rate, the intrinsic rate of growth or growth rate. Exactly. And what is K again?
Carrying capacity.
Awesome, exactly. So you could see, you could ask this question, 4 different ways. What is this? What is this? And then number 2 gets a little more complex. So which term of the model describes the per capita rate of growth? So that's going to be associated with the per capita is including the carrying capacity. So this obviously it's this equation because it's highlighted. But again, it's just important to know to be able to answer these questions. Okay, so which term in the model describes the number of offspring born in the population? And it says none, but is that true for all of these equations that we've seen so far, the exponential, the geometric, and the logistic?
I thought the geometric had a like an in sub value that did have that rate as part of it, but I couldn't remember exactly. I got that question wrong like 2 times in a row.
This question right here?
Yeah.
Well, I'm asking it a little different. This is just for the logistic growth. So the logistic growth does not have, none of these terms, I should say, that are listed describes the number of offspring born in the population. It is possible, like we can figure that out from the other equations if we solve them, and we know from year one we have 100 and we have this growth rate, and if say for geometric we have lambda and we have then we solve for the next population for year two. We can say, and then we can take year two population and subtract year's one population from it, and that difference is actually then going to be how many offspring were born to that population that year. So it's none of the terms in the actual equation here, but you can solve for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, cool. Okay. And then for number one, it gives us, so this is one of the kind of plug and chug activities. So what is the growth of a population if n equals 20, r equals 1.2, and k equals 250? Knowing that we're given these three values, which of the three models are we going to be using? The exponential, the geometric, or the logistic?
Logistic, because it has carrying capacity.
Yep, exactly. So what I'll do is I'm going to slide my notes over here. We can see my Word document, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is that question. So we have our values here, and then we use logistic, like you said, because it has carrying capacity. And then that equation is change in population, so change in n divided or over change in time, right? So it's r times n, parentheses 1 minus n over k, and we just plug in the values. R is 1.2, n is 20, because that's just what we're given. The 1 is a constant, so 1 minus 20 over k is 250. That's just all given up here. Plug them in, and the answer is going to be 22.8 if we use a decimal. But they tell us that the answer is 22. And why is it a solid 22 and not 22.08?
You can't have a portion of an individual.
Exactly.
I got that one wrong like 3 times because I didn't realize that there was a parentheses, or there like should have been in the 1 minus, I thought it was like 1 minus n over all over the carrying capacity. So I would do like 19 over 250. And I was like, why have I
Yeah.
got this wrong? Okay, I'm glad you showed us your notes because that made a lot more sense. That helped.
Okay, good. Yeah, and that's why we have these practice questions. And if that happens again, feel free to scroll down and you can, write me, I don't understand why I'm getting this number, and show me your work, and then I can take a look at it and maybe point that out in the future if that happens with other equations. So, but I'm glad we solved that for the group right here. Okay. All right. So that's how to do a calculation with logistics. So we have seen, an activity, hence we'll be responsible for having to do this calculation, this level of calculation on the exam. Okay. So then this gets into this kind of a cool example, I thought, with real data. And they tried to use a logistic model to predict human growth over time. And the predicted model is this hashed line, and the actual data is the red line with dots. And as you can see in the beginning, starting in 1790, it matches perfectly until we hit about 1930, 1950. Then the prediction way under predicts the actual human growth. And why was that? Why don't humans follow the predicted logistic growth?
Because we have infinite resources. I don't know if that's a good answer. I think like mostly like because we're able to like develop and like have technology that like other species don't. then we can like kind of break that curve and like provide processed food, or we can do like filter water differently than like a bird can't filter water. If there's no water, there's no water. And so that's why.
No, you're definitely right on track. I mean, it's modern technology is the answer they give in cookbooks. And in particular, it's, we can grow food. We don't have to be hunter and gatherers anymore, right? We do hunting and gathering in a grocery store. Our food is processed for us. So we have not necessarily unlimited, but we have very, very high levels of resources. And we also have modern technology in the form of medicine, right? If we get a virus that would have killed us back in the 1800s, we can get a vaccine for that most times now, right? So we are able to push our population above the levels of, essentially we're able to raise our carrying capacity above what a logistic growth model would predict. And that's a limited model, remember? So it's not full reality. It's obviously missing some key variables. So it's not a good model to predict human growth anymore. It might have been before modern technology, but after that, there's more variables that would need to be added to the model. All right. And that pretty much takes care of T9. Is there any questions, anything we wanted to go back over in T9? Okay, and if anybody watching this later has questions, obviously, feel free to email, message me. Anybody has questions later, they review it and something's not making sense again, I'm always available. So right now, why don't we go ahead and move on to T10. And this has to do, again, with population, not growth as much, but more population cycles is what it's called. So this first one talks about monitoring moose in Michigan, which is kind of a cool example. It just really showed the predator-prey effect of how wolves are predators to moose and they can drive their populations down. But I think the virus came out at one point and knocked out a bunch of the wolves. And when the wolves were removed, the moose population was able to rebound and grow again, and essentially change the carrying capacity and the interactions and the population size fluctuations between a predator and prey is going to cause cycles, essentially oscillating cycles between both of them. And we'll get into a little bit more details as we see some of the figures later on. But this is kind of just a neat study for an introduction to that concept. Okay. And then this talks about populations fluctuating over time, right? So just visually, we have number of deer on the y-axis and we have time. So over time, we have growth, decline, growth, decline, growth, more decline, growth. And other than predation, what we just mentioned, what are some of the factors that affect population levels? Why do they cycle?
Pathogens and competitors.
Yeah, pathogens is definitely one. Even we can throw viruses in that same category. So things that are going to hurt or kill we can use deer as the example here. You said competitors, correct?
Yes.
What do competitors take away from each other?
Any type of like resource, like the nesting sites, the food, the water availability, some situations oxygen. I guess a competitor could be any abiotic or biotic factor,
Well,
depending on the
the
situation.
competitor would be the biotic factor. You're definitely on track
Yeah.
here. And they affect some of the abiotic components, such as access to certain resources. So
Yeah.
someone else said climate and temperature. Yeah, so from 1975 to 2005 for deer, climate could be a factor, right? We could have one year where we have a really bad drought and there's not a lot, and that affects the food that's available for them. We have a die-off. We could have one year that's a really bad winter. Again, it decreases the resources available, but the cold itself could actually kill the deer. So climate is a great one, and the different factors that make up climate, the weather or the temperature. And in a pond, right? If you took away a lot of the vegetation, we could deplete a lot of the oxygen levels. So it could be oxygen in certain environments. Exactly. Yeah. So this just talks about all the different reasons that populations could potentially fluctuate over time. And then what do we So this is a little different than what we've seen before, right? We have our carrying capacity, and we've always seen the plot go up to it and kind of taper off. But here we see it break the line and then come back underneath it. What's going on here?
It's not a direct like cause and effect. Like the second you go over the line, it's not going to necessarily kill everything in the place. So it's like if you go over the line with like, I guess offspring had that season, the mothers won't nurse or, take care of them until a certain point. But then it's like once the resources that are necessary, deplete themselves, then it will start to, die off at, I guess, almost an equally exponential rate, it seems.
Yeah, and this is a theoretical curve, so it's nice and neat. So it's just to get the idea out there. And later when we get into some of these other actual data sets like the FlixWeed, we'll see it's not as clean, but your idea was right on, right? So you have initial population grows over time up to its carrying capacity, but hey, times are good. We're going to keep eating, keep reproducing. We're over our carrying capacity. And then they look around and go, oh, wait, where did all our resources go kind of idea. Then they start to die. But like you said, as soon as you cross that line, you don't fall over dead, right? It takes time for organisms to starve for, it there's like this a lag effect essentially that happens where they have a little bit of an overshoot and then they have a die off. And the die off usually is a little, not great. They don't stop again at the carrying capacity. They die off until those resources essentially are able to replenish. And once those are able to replenish, then it can go back up towards that carrying capacity and grow again. And then this is kind of a graphical depiction of the wolf and the moose, and it does a good job of showing the predator-prey cycles, but this lag effect, where we have moose in green, and we have wolves in blue, and we start right around here, we have kind of low numbers of moose, so we're having a decrease in the wolf population, even though now the moose population is starting to grow. And as we said, now it's crossed, that wolf population doesn't immediately jump back up. There takes a little bit of time and then it does follow back up. And then they're both growing and the wolves continue to grow. And then the moose eventually will decline. And the reason for that is that, as we said, there's this lag effect. So the wolves have to physically kill the moose, they have to eat them, ingest them as energy, and put that energy into their offspring. So it takes time for the wolves to, once they produce their litters, but they have the whole gestation period, right? So it can take, months or years and multiple cycles to actually get their population up. It's not an immediate effect. And this does a good job of just showing how that cycle it doesn't track itself. There's that lag effect in there. Then this one, so this is just number of reindeer over time. And I don't remember so it talks about how they introduced initially 25 reindeer in Alaska. The population experienced a rapid increase in size that approximated the exponential growth. And then the population crashed, probably because the animals exhausted the food supply. So I think what they're getting at here is they had an introduction of species, but they didn't really regulate it. They kind of just let them go. The environment wasn't used to this organism. They probably didn't have very many predators, and they grew exponentially, essentially to start, ate themselves out of resources, and had a big population crash. Now, if they would have had predators or potentially opened maybe a hunting season to kind of cap it when they got near what they expected their carrying capacity, they might not have seen this dramatic crash and they might have seen it kind of stabilize.
I had a question about the interactions with the wolves and the moose.
Sure.
So whenever there's like it looks like those are pretty like interdependent species. So if it seems that at different points there's different carrying capacities for either, so the carrying capacity is not limited to a certain number for each. It looks like the moose are affected by the wolves, and so it's like the moose get all the way up to almost 2,500 at one point, but their other carrying capacity for the other like top part of the graph is not even to 1,500.
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up. And what's affecting carrying capacity, certainly it's wolves because they're killing them. So they're removing them from the population. But as we talked about too, right? There's more than one thing that's probably going to affect carrying capacity. This could have been 1979. This could have been a really harsh winter, right? A bunch of moose could have just not made it through the winter here. But we also saw, a really big wolf population, so that kind of knocked it down too. And then we see the lowest wolf population here and the highest moose population. So there does seem to be some strong effect, if it's definitely some strong correlation, if not effect of the wolf, but you're certainly right that it's not consistent because nature's messy and there's multiple variables that could be affecting. There could have been some sort of pathogen that came out at one point and killed either the moose or the wolf. There could be competition for predators. Maybe the mountain lion population got big and took on a bunch of moose as well. They opened a hunting season. It knocked down the population quite a bit. So yeah, there could be a number of variables working together to either increase or decrease or countering each other to change that carrying capacity from year to year. So really good point. And what this page does, it kind of just elaborates a little bit on what we've been building on. So if we look at the example, we have two different locations. We have the top blocks here that are like a greenish color in this area, and we have in Finland. So then we have the yellow or the lower squares here that are just two different geographic regions. So they're not even touching. But if we look at population cycles, we kind of see they're kind of similar, right? They all start kind of high. So this is across three different species and different locations, right? They start high and they tend to have this decreasing pattern, but they don't always completely match. And again, this gets at the idea that we can see population cycles over large landscapes because the climate might have been a big factor. I mean, you're right, they're not touching in their area, but if they had winter in Finland, a really bad one, it might affect both populations. If there's a disease, it could cross populations. So it just shows us like on a larger scale, populations within and across species in different locations can see similar population fluctuations. Okay. And now this is actually, we already talked about it, but it brings up this lag effect. So it talks about how cycles occur when density dependence lags behind growth. And what that looks like, we can see in some of these equations, right? So originally we said this was going to be our population growth and it was going to just plateau at carrying capacity. But then we saw previously in the beginning of this section that it overshoots carrying capacity often, and then it has a die-off effect and will kind of undershoot it. And then once the resources get replenished, it can go back towards carrying capacity and it can kind of overshoot it, but you can see it's not as big of an effect here. And it kind of has this dampening oscillation. So it's just a different pattern. And then we could have population cycles that are more consistent where they overshoot it, they undershoot it, they overshoot it, and they undershoot it. And there's not this dampening, but more consistent pattern. And because of that, it's going to be related to when we model delayed density dependence, we have this equation here that works with a logistic growth model. So this is a logistic growth model right here that we've already seen. And when we have a delayed effect, it's the same thing as a logistic growth, but it has this new factor in here. And that stands for the time of delay. So the greater the time of the delay, so the greater the value here, the more we're going to see this overshoot and undershoot. We have intermediate values of delay. We might get a dampened oscillation that eventually stabilizes at carrying capacity. And if we have really short times of delay, where we might not even see it, it might just hit carrying capacity and stabilize. And what are some examples of these types of delays? Like, what are we talking about in a biological sense? What's being delayed? So we kind of talked about it with wolves, right? They have to ingest the food and produce a litter. So their growth is delayed based on essentially their energy intake and their gestation period until they can produce offspring.
Could a parent investment be one of the delay factors? It's like, because if a species has higher like parent investment, then they could delay it further.
Yeah, I could see the argument parental investment because it's going to keep their offspring alive. So they're going to need to feed their offspring. So they're going to need to hunt at higher levels potentially. So one of the examples they gave was the large herbivores such as moose breed in the fall, but do not give birth until the spring. So if food is super abundant in the fall, carrying capacity is going to be high by the time the offspring are born in spring, but it might be that in spring it's a delayed winter and there's not as many resources available, and therefore the carrying capacity is going to be lowered, and the death is going to take time for those offspring in you're not going to see that death rate until the spring. So it's delayed from when the moose are pregnant until they give birth, and if there are not enough resources. And another one they gave was on the predator side. So it says when predators experience an increase in prey, their carrying capacity increases. So, right, so this is kind of what we saw with the wolves. Their carrying capacity would increase with the moose, but then the moose would go down. And eventually it takes time for the wolves to kind of starve and not be able to produce offspring, but then theirs is going to go, carrying capacity is going to go down. So kind of big circle, it's all connected about limiting resources, right? And it just depends on how long it takes for turnover of those resources to produce into actual more offspring or turn into starvation. So whether it's going to increase the population or decrease the population. If with fast reproducing organisms such as insects, you might see really fast cycles. And with slower reproducing organisms such as wolves or moose, you might see more delayed or slower cycles. Okay. And then this is kind of a neat experiment with two types of, I think, water fleas, but they have different biologies. So this water flea up here, we're going to see really high and low kind of fast cycles, and we don't really see where carrying capacity is from this data set so far. And the reason being is they're not able to store any energy. So when energy is really available, they increase, but when that resource is depleted, they crash. When it replenishes, they climb again, and then they crash when it's depleted. Versus this species here is a little different, where initially they grow, but they're able to like retain resources in the form of lipids. So they have these small crashes, and they might actually stabilize and have their carrying capacity kind of higher because of the fact that they're able to retain resources. And the carrying capacity up here is probably going to be lower because as soon as the resources are depleted, they're going to very rapidly crash. So their carrying capacity might overall kind of be lower. And we saw a similar pattern here where they had unlimited food for adults and limited food for adults. And it just showed essentially we have different cycles, different peaks, and this one you can even see, like this is probably where the carrying capacity is a lot higher than it is for this one. So again, resources that are limited are going to affect where the carrying capacity is and how large we see these oscillations in the population cycles to be. All right, and then this one, this is an example using a plant, and it gives us some variables, right? It gives us K, so our starting population, it gives us R, our growth rate, and it gives us this, it looks like a lowercase t, I actually forget what it's called at the moment. It's called tau, T-A-U is what this stands for, and that's the delayed term, so the time. And then it gives us some more data. It tells us the population sizes. For year one, it was 20 plants per square meter. And year two, oh wait, no, sorry. I have 10 plants for year one and 20 plants in year two. And then it wants us to start calculating the population change for the next, I think, 15 years, or through year 15 at least. And I will say, I don't fully understand why it just uses the logistic growth equation. If you notice, it doesn't include tau at all. I don't know why they did that for this example. So you will not be responsible for modeling or calculating density dependence because they don't actually give you an example. It would just be, again, a repeat of the logistic growth here. But since they have this example, we can go ahead and kind of walk through it. So we have our logistic growth equation here, where we have change in the population N over time equals our growth rate, our population at year 2 minus 1 over NK, and this is the population at year 1. So when we plug in all the numbers, R is going to be, I wish they're closer together. R is 1.1, so it's up here. Right here. So this is R, and then population N2, so that's in year 2. They told us that. So that's 20 plants in year 2. And that's 1 minus N1, which is the population in year 1, which they told us again is 10 plants, divided by K, the carrying capacity, which they told us above is 100. So then 1.1 times 20 times 1 minus 0.1, eventually, well, you calculate it out to be 20. And it's rounded off because I think it would be 19 point something if, yeah, 19.8 if we actually use the decimal place. But again, you can't have partial organisms. And eventually what we get through, they ask us, yeah, hold on. Let's go to the feedback page because this will show us the chart. So they ask us to do it. They show us how to do it for the first year. And then this is the output where you get total population size, change in the population, and over time. So in year 1, they told us the population was 10, so we could just enter that. In year 2, they told us the population is 20, so we can just enter that as well. And then they ask, what's the change in population from year 1 to year 2? You just take 20 minus 10, and that gets you 10, right? And you can do that for any of these. So if they ask, what's the change in population here? It's 158 minus 124 equals 34. But what I want to show is, if I can drag this over here, move. No, don't go full. This over here. This is, I worked out the equations through year 5, and then you could continue this if you wanted, but I want to point out how we get these numbers, right? So to fill in year 3, what we'd have to do is the change in population over time. So you have R times N2 times 1 minus N1 over K. And we know that R is always going to be 1.1. So you notice in every equation, it's 1.1 for R, 1.1 for R, 1.1 for R. That's simple enough. That's never going to change. What does change is this goes to N2, N3, N4, and in the parentheses, we have, it's 1 behind because it's the delayed effect. We have N1, N2, N3, but we know what N1 is, we know what N2 is, and here we just solve for N3, right? Oh, no, we didn't, sorry. This is the change in the population is 20, but then what we need to do is we need to take that 20, we need to add it to the previous year, which was from over here, it's 20, and we got 20. Why did it just do that? Okay. And then the total for that population in year 3 is going to be 39.8, and that's where this number comes from, because you have to add the numbers together to get it. And then in year 4, we up that equation. Now we have N3 and N2 in there, and we know what N3 is, right? N3 is going to be that value we got up here, 39.8. R is going to stay the same. So we multiply it by N3, 1 minus N2. We know from, it gave us that, that's up here, that's 20 over 100. Carrying capacity is always going to stay the same as well. And then that equals 35.2. We take that value, we add it to the previous year up here, So 35.2 plus 39.8 gets us our 74.8. That's our total population size in year 4. That's where this number comes from right here. Don't like it that it does that. And then for year 5, it's the same thing, right? So now we go N3 to N4, N2 to N3. R is the same, K is the same. We just solved for N4. We already have N3. So we just plug the values in. Our 74.8 for N4 gets plugged in right there. Our 39.8 that we solved for from up here from year 3 gets plugged in up here. And our carrying capacity of 100 stays the same. We do the math, get 49.5. Add that to the previous year of 74.8. So 49.5 plus 74.8 gives us 124 for the total population size in year 5. And that's what this value is then right here. Stop doing that. Now, does that make sense? Like, and you would just continue doing this through year 15. Does this make sense, or is there anything that's not clear on how to build these equations and calculate from year to year?
So whenever we calculate, we're just calculating, like the answer to the equation is just the difference, and we have to take the previous answer and then add it to that to get like the total year after year.
Yes. Yeah, you're
Okay.
only getting it for that 1 year. Yeah, so you get 19.8, 35.
Those are only the changes.
Yeah. Yes, and then to get the total population, you add it together.
Okay. Where is the like missing tau variable? Where does that go?
In this example, it doesn't exist. That's why I mentioned
Okay.
before, this is just using the logistic growth equation, and that's the example they give. So that's what I'm reviewing with that's how you get these. I'm pointing with my hand. That's how you get these values. I think
Okay.
it's a typo. It's a missed opportunity to use a delayed effect. I think it was an oversight when they created it, but that's what we have to work with. So that's what we have to go with. You won't have to calculate with tau in there.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so essentially we could think of this, what we're doing is using a logistic growth equation, calculate growth for 15 years. There's no delayed effect in this growth. In this particular example, tau essentially would equal 0.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And then once we would fill in all the values for the total population size, we could make this plot. And these are all just the numbers plotted, and it actually shows that there's a fluctuation. And it seems to be kind of a dampening oscillation. And that's just kind of an example to walk through using some real data. And it's kind of neat because we see, the change in the population, it's not continuous growth. We get some loss in the population for some years. We get some growth again, it recovers, some loss again, probably because it's overshooting its carrying capacity, right? That's why we're getting this drop off or die off, as it was described in cog books. And then when the resources are replenished, it's able to grow back up. And I would imagine, if I had to guess, the carrying capacity is probably, wait, actually, you don't have to guess. It tells us, right?
It's 100.
Yeah,
I
so
think.
yeah, exactly. Carrying capacity is 100. So we know that we would draw a line right here. So that makes perfect sense that it's overshooting and it followed by a die-off and recovery, because it's overshot it all 3 times thus far in this 15-year data set. And it will probably dampen and stabilize once it gets around 100. Are there any other questions on this part? Got
I'm
some
okay.
good ones so far. Okay. All right. So then this part talks about random events can cause populations to become extinct. What are some random events that could lead to extinction?
From the very first unit, they talked about storms and hurricanes in the tropics.
Mhm. So storms could be one.
I guess weather in general, seasonal
Yeah,
stuff.
weather could be natural disasters, could be a volcano, could be a fire, anything like that. Could be disease, maybe an introduced invasive species has an effect. And with these random events, are large populations or small populations more impacted?
Small.
Yeah, smaller populations, right? There's less of them. So if the storm comes through and kills 10 individuals, and that there's only 8 individuals on one island and 12 on the other, the one with 8 is probably going to die and go extinct, and the one with 12 will be able to survive that. Not very well. They're going to have low genetic diversity, but that's different argument. The smaller population is more likely to go extinct than a larger population is the key takeaway. And this just talks about the probability of extinction over time, I think, is an example, but I think this one down here is a little bit better. So larger populations, the probability of extinction is going to take longer, so more generations essentially, to go extinct with a bigger population than with a smaller population.
You mentioned invasive species. Do these models apply to like invasive species or native species? Because you would think that they would be very different from invasives because they tend to just like bloom out of control if they are successful at all.
These models are very basic, so they don't incorporate a variable that stands for like invasive species, because the only competition that any of these models talk about is intraspecific competition. So I mean, you could use it to model the growth of an invasive species itself, but not the impact of an invasive species on a native species. Those would be more complicated models that we'll get to some models that are about competition and predation and after this exam. But currently, no. All right, and then it talks about these different types of models. So it talks about what's a deterministic model. In one sentence, if we would describe it.
It predicts, or the definition is when a model is designed to predict a result without accounting for random variation in population growth, we say it's deterministic.
Yeah, so it's a model that predicts population growth without accounting for any random variation in the population. So it's pretty baseline. What about a stochastic model? A little bit more advanced because, right, it incorporates some random variation in population growth rates. So deterministic will say the population growth rate is X forever. The stochastic says that it could be X 1 year, it could be, W 1 year, and you could use numeric value as well. It could be, 0.1, 0.5, 0.6. Stochastic means that it can change over time, which is a little bit more realistic because we know that population fluctuate over time and they have different growth rates over time because of that. So stochastic models are probably a little better than deterministic models. And then it talks about another type of model, right? The demographic stochasticity. What does that include?
Death rates and birth rates contrasted against each other.
Yeah, so there's random variation in death rates and birth rates due to differences among individuals and not due to changes in the environment. So that's just due to the individual. Where environmental stochasticities, that includes random variation in birth and death rates, but that's due to changes in environmental conditions. So that gets back to like our weather examples, right? If we have a really harsh winter, we might have really low birth rates in that spring. Okay, and that gets us basically to the end of this module. Is there anything from T10 that we want to talk about yet, or doesn't make quite sense yet?
I think I'm okay with most of it.
Okay. And again, if anybody watching has questions from this module or the previous one, feel free to email me, and any other modules for this exam as well. I will make an announcement with a time, once I figure my schedule out a little bit better for Friday due to some work conflict stuff. But I will have another office hour on Friday and we will go over the next module, so T11. That one's a bit longer and has a lot of math in it, so I figure if we just focus on that one for Friday, that could take us, through that office hours, and then I will have another set of office hours on Monday to go over the last two modules, and that'll get us through all 5 of the modules, because there's an extra one. The first 2 exams had 4 modules, this exam has 5 modules. And that gives us, plenty of time before the exam, which is next Wednesday already, so that is, we gotta keep plugging along with these. But yeah, with no more questions, then I will go ahead and end this session, and thank everybody that was able to join in and participate in this office hour. I'll talk to you
Thank
guys
you,
on
Mr.
Friday.